Well, so welcome everybody who's joining us. The room is filling up. Welcome to the Architecture Club 2021 Spring Forum on gentle radicalism, new approaches to growing vibrant and viable communities in the countryside, which is a fantastic subject. And we're going to be hearing four different opinions about this from our speakers tonight. My name is Flora Samuel. I'm Professor of Architecture in the Built Environment at the University of Reading. The reason I wanted to chair this is I'm very exercised about the relationship between the city and the countryside as we go forward after the pandemic. I think there are enormous potential opportunities for making the world a better place, making our quality of life infinitely better through the way we think about the two. So I'll do brief introductions to the folk who we've got here in the room, starting off with Petra. Petra Marko is an architect, co-founder of Marko and Placemakers, and director of Solid Space, and a member of the Velocity team, proposing a radical vision for reimagining the future of the countryside. And then we have, next we have Ben Rawlence. Ben is a writer and founder of Black Mountain College, and which is a transformational new tertiary college based in Wales. And Ben, you are there as we speak, are you not? You are. Fantastic. And then we have Robbie. Robbie Kerr has been a director of Adam Architecture since 2016, after joining in 2010, and he's an architect and urban designer. And last of all, we have Rob Hopkins, who's a co-founder of Transition Towns, Totnes, and the Transition Network, and the author of the Transition Handbook. So we have a really wonderful selection of speakers. So before we get started, just want to remind you, if you've got any questions, put them in the Q&A box, and I'll be bringing them up at the end after our talks, which should seamlessly progress from one to the next, all being well. So please think of lots of questions. We'll leave plenty of time for discussion at the end. So we're going to start off with Petra. Over to you, Petra.
Thanks, Flora. I've got some slides, so let me share this quickly. So I'm Petra Marko, and I'm a member of the Velocity team, as Flora said, and contrary to the name, actually the ideas and vision that we've developed is all about rural areas and villages, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The Velocity team is 6 of us who met actually as friends cycling, but then we formed into a professional team to enter the National Infrastructure Commission competition for growth and placemaking along the Oxford-Cambridge corridor. And instead of looking at cities, which naturally we think should densify and be developed sustainably, we wanted to look at the countryside and villages because of what we all know is happening in terms of an aging population, people being isolated, and there's lots of services that historically have been in villages but have been lost, such as the shop or the school or the pub, and there's an increasing dependency on cars for people doing their daily needs. And the other thing what's happening is that there is development in the countryside, but what we see is kind of quite large houses built along roads, so there's a linear sprawl, and it's a very low density development, and it's a type of housing that many young families can't afford. But we also see that there's a huge opportunity, and actually we have to look at what's happening in the countryside, not just in the cities, especially because there's housing pressure which will only increase. Now during COVID, we've seen that there's more people who might be interested to take the opportunities of remote working or part-time working from home. So the housing pressure in the countryside will only increase, and it's important to think about how housing can be developed differently. And we know there's 10,000 villages in England, only 1 or 2 miles apart, which makes them ideal to be interconnected through a fine-grained network of walking and cycling paths. So the first principle of Velocity is really people over cars, and the other one is talking about denser housing typologies tightly around the village core rather than the sprawl that I had mentioned. But we're not only looking at the individual villages, but we see the villages as a network and a network of a sharing economy. So each village can have different services that the people can benefit from. And also we need to look at work in rural areas and diversification of sort of live work typologies and opportunities in that sense. And our strategy overall is about enhancing biodiversity and protecting the landscape as well by having the housing built closer to the villages and keeping in the character of the villages. So when we looked at the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, we discovered that there's a series of village clusters and town clusters in a 7-mile radius around railway stations, and we wanted to interconnect these, taking cars to the edges, opening up the bridleways and pathways in between the villages, and pedestrianizing the village course so that you will have a safe space in the villages, and to prevent the red running that we see with some of the heavy vehicles currently taking shortcuts through villages. And it would be always a 10 to 15-minute cycle from the furthest village to the railway station. In between the villages, we call it a big back garden. We wanted to protect the landscape, but we wanted to use the landscape also productively, closely around the villages to make them partially self-sufficient in terms of food production or increase food production on a small scale local level. And the big back garden could be a really the heart of the village cluster where it can evolve differently in each location. So there's this idea of a sharing economy across all the scales of the velocity idea, where you could have a local surgery in one village, and then you have a library in another village and a school in another one. But by connecting them with active travel, you can actually have a very sustainable cluster where you could do most of your daily needs within your village or village cluster. And we have also tested it ourselves and cycled around Oxford-Cambridge corridor and talked to some of the locals and farmers who have started diversifying their businesses. And we wanted to take clues from the existing housing typologies, but also some of the farm sheds and the industrial buildings that we see in rural areas, because it's not only the picturesque cottages that we can see. And on the right-hand side, the diagram shows that our proposal is looking at radically reducing the amount of road and parking space, which at the moment in a typical housing development takes up to 40% of the space. So our new typologies that we've developed, we're also looking at live work typologies, higher density flats and houses. And in this imagined village diagram, you can see that the gray buildings are the historic village core, and then there's some, the orange ones are some of the depot sheds where you could get deliveries and get deliveries to the edges of the village to keep the village walkable. And in terms of scale, when we are talking about slightly higher density, actually it's very amenable to the existing typologies, and it's not overpowering to the local landmarks, such as the church in a village. Since winning the competition in 2017, we have spoken to different government bodies, and we've been building partnerships to develop the vision. We've got funding from the RBA and the Clarion Housing Group, the William Sutton Prize, which helped us take it further. We've exhibited at the Oslo Architecture Triennale, where we have launched our manifesto, and also spoken to possible partners such as Brompton, who are looking at expanding into the countryside and increasing active travel there. So we have visited a number of case studies as part of our research, and we went to Sweden and Denmark, but we also looked locally. And for instance, the village Dent in Cumbria and Yorkshire Dales was a very interesting case study, a historic village very much considered picturesque, but actually it's very high density, 68 dwellings per hectare. And there were some really interesting lessons from there, looking at these narrow cobbled streets, which kept the village very walkable, and then the grass-screened parking outside of the village, which completely blended into the landscape, and a very active community with notice board with the barn door, which sort of acts online and in the real world as the community hub. Since last year, we've been working with Blenheim Estate, for whom we've developed a vision for connecting the villages on the estate. So Blenheim owned Blenheim Palace and a series of villages around. We've also identified opportunity to create 2 new villages to complete the cluster and open up some of the pathways. Last summer, there were trial paths opened across the Blenheim Palace Park, which were for children to cycle to school, and they had actually been turned into permanent paths. So we were looking at all potential sort of daily routes that you might want to take and how we can incentivize active travel, sort of using bike buses for children, where a number of children can cycle together to school and things like that. And we've recently we've submitted a proposal together with Blenheim to Oxfordshire Open Thought. So that's the Oxfordshire County Council's forum for engagement for the 2050 vision. So this was drawing on velocity principles, but looking more specifically at Oxfordshire and how a series of clusters of villages around the idea can be developed. So we think really the velocity as idea is practical because it's low cost using existing infrastructure. You don't have to lay new roads. You're basically using right of ways and pathways. And a lot of people who have commented on the open thought submissions were saying, you know, we'd love our pathways to be opened up and to be used, and we'd love to get on bikes more. It's transformative because it's looking at planning, turning planning on its head really, and we think it's replicable across the UK, and you can read up more about it on our website, and I look forward to discuss with the rest of the team. So that's me. Thanks. Thank you.
Next up is Ben.
I'll pick up the baton from Petra. Thank you very much, Petra. There's lots of parallels with our rural area here in the Black Mountains. And we face many of the similar problems that you outlined in that first slide to do with aging populations, congestion along particular trunk roads, all sorts of issues with isolation, social deprivation, mental health, jobs, skills. And the vision for Black Mountains College originated with a grappling with some of those problems. The number one critical risk for Powys County Council is the aging of the population of Mid Wales. And I think the projections are that within the next couple of decades, the population of people under 30 is going to crash, and the population of people over 80 is going to balloon. So understandably, the county council is very anxious about who's going to be paying council tax and who's going to be looking after all of those older people. So the intergenerational agenda is a big one. The skills agenda is a big one, as well as the retention of younger people. So Black Mountains College emerged as a response to some of those problems, but also within the context of climate change. What can we do to address those problems whilst also making a contribution to this wider framing problem? And I think what we've come up with is a model, which I'll explain, but which I think has relevance to almost any ecosystem or any community. And it starts really with embedding the idea of learning across the community, across the generations, and making the community an active site of learning. So we have developed a range of different educational offerings, short courses, further education, and a unique kind of undergraduate degree, all of which are centrally concerned with opportunities for learning, grappling with climate change. What does that mean? And what we've come up with, we think, is a very interesting and engaging spread of offers, which presents an opportunity for anybody, regardless of their background, to consider what this means for them and to find a pathway to seeking the skills that might be necessary for the kind of transformation that's coming down the track very rapidly. And I think that then has a whole cascade of implications for planning, for how we think about rural communities, also how we think about ecosystems, and then more broadly, how we think about social and political organization, both in this country and further afield. So if I tell you a little bit about our journey so far, and then I'll finish with some sharp questions around our current planning application, which I think put into relief some of the points that Petra made about Velo City in terms of turning planning on its head. So we essentially asked the question, what can our landscape offer? And we thought that there are very few universities in the UK which are based in a rural area. It's a much more common feature of liberal arts colleges, higher education institutions in the United States, North America, and elsewhere. But there are very few in the UK apart from agricultural colleges. So we are a university based in a rural area, but we are not an agricultural college. So we are using the land and the ecosystems of the national park as a classroom, as a testing ground, as a laboratory and a research territory to explore the idea of what needs to change in order to limit climate breakdown. Obviously, we're not going to stop it at this point, but we're going to we're going to try and limit it, and we're going to try and learn to live with it. And looking at the landscape in that way, all of the UK is a severely degraded, ruined landscape. And there are opportunities for nature recovery across the board. So therefore, any patch of ground is an opportunity for nature recovery, but also a potential laboratory and a potential classroom, even that 1 square meter of ground, right outside your house. So looked at in that way, we then thought, right, what are the kinds of learning opportunities that we can we key into the landscape? And the first are short courses to do with personal reflection, sort of retreats, and consideration about personal behavior change. And those are relatively easy to do, and you can put them on anywhere. You can even do them online. But the second set of courses is a bit more in depth, is vocational training for what we call a program of future skills. So those are the sustainable skills for a sustainable circular economy, which are going to be increasingly necessary as the economy is hit with the kind of supply chain shocks that climate change is bringing. So we've got 3 courses launching this September, which are MVQ level 2 in seasonal catering, regenerative horticulture, and green woodworking and coppicing. So that's cooking, growing, and shelter, essentially, and trying to source those things much more locally rather than relying on attenuated supply chains around the world. And those are all based at sites of learning within local ecosystems. And those are essentially putting accredited pathways into existing institutions where there are existing people here with skills, and we're training them as assessors, and we're getting those courses accredited, and then we're marketing those courses more broadly to bring people here to establish the Brecon Beacons as a place where you come to learn how to get ready for a new kind of circular economy. And then the third the third educational offering that we're putting forward is a radical undergraduate program. And that's where we've been working with Featherstone Young Architects to develop a campus. That requires a bit more of a base, obviously a 3-year program, but it's based around the same principles. So we're bringing together everything that we know about how humans learn in terms of neuroscience and all the whole body learning and learning outside, learning with all your different senses. And we're then applying that learning to real world problems within the community and in the context of the Future Generations Act in Wales. So that undergraduate program is based here. Students are coming here to learn, but they're also coming to study and help the community become a model circular economy, in a sense, a transition town, as Rob is going to speak about shortly. And that sort of changes the dynamic about how you think about what our rural town is. It's a place to come rather than a place to drive through. And it poses all sorts of interesting challenges for planning, which I won't get into the detail now, but the nub of it is transport. And that is the kind of key point, I think, without over staying my welcome here, is around applying how we think about urban solutions to a rural setting. So, for example, walking 20 minutes or 30 minutes in a city is second nature, but all of the planning decisions and planning frameworks here in the countryside treat that as unviable. And we're trying to push the envelope and say that actually that's key to how we think about living here. Thank you. And I believe it's one of the Robs to follow me next, but I can't remember which.
I think it's me. So unless Rob wants to jump in and tell me to
yes,
back down. Thank you very much, Ben. And I suppose it's good, promising that what's been said over the last two talks resonates on through. And it's also good to be discussing for here the sort of 85% of land that's outside of the urban centres, and is clearly going to take on a new shift going forward. Our rural heritage and identity has at times been given almost a mythical status, one that conjures sort of evocative, at times rose-tinted perspectives. And for many, they should be frankly frozen in aspect, and that perhaps is where some of the problem lies. Change and growth can help these rural settlements, and done with care, as I hope good examples from around the profession can demonstrate, it can be done to complement and work with the charm that many of these people cherish in their settlements. So change doesn't need to be bad. Indeed, change hopefully helps give new viability to them. Now, COVID, of course, has changed the way so much of what we do works and the way we think. And it may not be as radical as we all hear today, as we sit here, hopefully on the dawn of returning to some sort of normality. But people have made life decisions, and their quality of life, to pick up on something that Flora said at the beginning, I think is certainly something to reflect on. Businesses, whether they want people to come back to you or not, are going to have to adapt. And indeed, working from home has been demonstrated to be immensely more feasible than perhaps had previously been accepted, except for the fact that in many rural locations, communication is perhaps a key consideration. I suppose it's slightly ironic, having spent the first half of my lockdown in the countryside, where I had better high-speed fibre than I do here in London, but that again ties in with government work. Now, Adam Architecture commissioned some years ago some research called Tomorrow's Home, and it identified a number of trends amongst my generation on how we were going to be changing the way we worked and lived. And one of the key findings, actually, which I think is perhaps been sped up by COVID, is that as a generation are happy to travel further to work, but less often. And again, I think most of us can see that parallel now coming forward. And so, of course, as people do move out, there's an opportunity to start to work with some of these static and aging populations, to perhaps take on some of Ben's points, and certainly to build into some of Petra's points, and to work with these patterns to help change the way that the economy of these small settlements can work. Indeed, where you had these commuter settlements and vacuums created by people moving out, now I think actually we're going to find that there's increased spending power captured within these villages, and that in turn may well change the way we work. Some of my schemes at the early stages at the moment are actually picking up on this. We're finding that community facilities within our high streets that we're designing or adapting are being built with more flexible uses. They're becoming hubs for local activities, as well as flexible working spaces, perhaps people bored of listening to their partners on Zoom the whole time. And actually also tying in with nurseries, so that you start to be able to build those different peaks of activity together. And again, I think that's going to start to reinvigorate these smaller rural settlements. And so I suppose understanding these changes is vital to helping shape the way that we develop in our rural settlements. It's interesting also to see that the flexibility that units of about the 750 to 1100 square foot, perfect for adapting back to flats if not needed, are actually proving hugely popular in some of our more rural schemes. In Newquay, 20 units have been completed, and at the moment we have a 40+ waiting list. So clearly there's something very positive to be had in there. And as you start to tie that in with schemes that promote walking and cycling, much as Petra said, either by distance or by design. The connectivity will help reduce the burden of cars and, of course, importantly, promote better community interaction. Another of COVID's offshoots has been perhaps the resurgence in appreciation of nature. Some might argue that hasn't ever been, but for many, I think it's been heightened. And equally, I think it's worth reflecting on the challenges that many in more urban settings have found the lack of meaningful amenity has had on well-being and mental health. And again, maybe part of the resurgence that we're starting to see are people looking for the ability to work in a more rural, connected environment. And so when it does come to designing the rural context, we need to adapt to these shifting changes. And I think there's also a resurgence in being able to not just do it as it has been done, or to work with that inevitability. There's a growing number of landowners that are taking a more patient approach, one of stewardship and accountability, and a pride in what development can do to sustain and improve rural communities rather than perhaps rip them apart. They're taking longer term investments in their areas. They're being able to create a certainty that allows local businesses to invest in new apprenticeships. In Cornwall, there's been a resurgence in the ability to see the local slate quarries grow, and of course that's now having a wider UK benefit for those businesses. There's huge local investment that's coming into these rural economies, and again, I'm sure much of what Ben has been talking about has a similar parallel. And so looking into understanding where that built capital, but also the natural capital lies, helps then us design in a more sensitive way that can help reinforce the local community, local identity. It can also help us understand the built morphology, and so again, help the new development that's going in, designed in a more organic manner. Indeed, to say that, to get an earlier point, that our rural settlements should be fixed in aspect is missing the point. Our most heralded local settlements have evolved. And so to understand how to evolve in the right way is, I think, to understand how people can live and work and walk and interact as a community. Going back onto the point of nature, as one of my final points, I think it's also interesting to reflect within our master plans just how important this really is for this new wave of developers, landowners, whether it be using the space around the edges of our town, our new urban settlements, to enrich them with everything from allotments to sensitive use of landscape, to being able to use waste from building products in a more sustainable on-site manner, to the really quite obvious but really easy small details that are making a marked difference on the biodiversity and ecology of our new schemes. So from hedgehog highways to swift boxes and bee bricks and edible streets, there's so much potential to work with the assets that we find across the rural United Kingdom. And so as many of these landowners are taking a longer term view, it's starting to challenge those in the fast lane, those big PLCs. They're starting to turn their heads and are being forced to do things in a slightly different way. This matter of stewardship perhaps is a point that might take place over placemaking, and actually mean we have more meaningful development in some of our rural locations. Indeed, the financial power of the longer term views that these landowners are taking is actually seeing higher returns than might previously been expected. And so for me, it's exciting to see and be involved with these schemes where we're finding that good understanding of the place, the urban morphology and everything else is reducing the need for cars. And it'd be actually fascinating to see how the patterns of work that COVID has sped up can help shape and revitalize our villages across the UK. Thank you.
Thank you, Robbie. It's me now, I think. So hello, everybody. I'm Rob Hopkins, and I'm speaking to you from South Devon, and I've been very involved for a long time with the transition movement. So I'm going to share my screen, which hopefully you can now see. So the transition movement is something that I was very involved with from its beginning, which is about what we can do wherever we are in our community when we're faced with the climate and ecological emergency that we are currently in. What can we do where we are? Yes, there's stuff that business can do. There's the stuff that the government needs to do, and when we absolutely need to bring as much pressure for that kind of change. And of course, there's all those things we can do in our own lives: eat less meat, fly less, all that kind of stuff. But there's that bit in the middle, which is about what we can do with the people around us, whether it's small things like starting food gardens, starting kind of rewilding projects, whether it's bigger things like community energy companies, or really big ambitious things like some of the things I'm going to talk about. Actually, as communities, there's an enormous amount that we can do. And so I want to start by showing you this, which is something created by Julie Brown at Growing Communities in Hackney, an amazing community-supported agriculture project. They run a farmer's market, they run a veggie box. This is their model of how London might feed itself. And I think it's such genius, where they basically say that, you know, about 2.5% of London's food could come from back gardens and allotments, about 5% from what they call urban traded, new intensive market gardens, about 20% from kind of peri-urban land, and about 30 or 40% from within what they call the rural hinterland. And so when I look at this, the thing that always fascinates me about transition, and I'm going to share you stories of things that I've seen from the transition movement in different places, is how do we use, it's one thing to say, you know, in the countryside, we need to develop these new enterprises. And I love the work that Black Mountains College are doing in terms of training the people we're going to need for this shift. But also, how do we start to build a demand from the cities, so we reconnect the cities to the countryside around them? At the moment, they almost sort of work in isolation from each other. People go to the countryside for a holiday or something, but the countryside less and less is vital to the economy of the cities that they're nearby. So how might we start that? So I want to tell you a few stories, really. The first one is from Belgium, in Liège, in Belgium, where the transition group in Liège started a project a few years ago where they started with a what if question. They said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? Just fantastic, fantastic question. It also leads to a real reimagining of, well, what's our relationship with that land, with those communities, with that space? So they did a big event I went to where they launched this. I went back 4 years later. In Liège in that time, they started 25 new cooperatives, a farm, 2 vineyards, a brewery, these shops called the small producers. They started one, it was doing so well. They now have 4 in the center of the city, selling produce direct from local farmers at the price the farmers want. They just keep it really simple, and it's being phenomenally successful. This is what the project is called, Ceinture Alimentaire, which means food belt. This idea of rebuilding the food belt around our cities. This is a guy called Pascal who runs the first of those shops. I said to him, what's the potential of this? He said, I think by the time we have 12 of these shops, the supermarkets will start to fragilize. Word in French, fragiliser, which I've kind of stolen and turned into an English word. They have a project working with the local council who've mapped all the land that they own around Liège. They make it available through Ceinture Alimentaire to young people who want to come into growing food at low rents to get that land working again as part of the system. Brewery as well. I had to go and visit that. You know, we all have to make sacrifices for the revolution. This is in a place called Montsartou in France, which is about half an hour inland from Nice, where the municipality, it's a kind of a smallish kind of rural town where the municipality bought land on the edge of the town that was going to be developed for executive homes, and instead used it to create a market garden where they produce 70% of all the food for the schools in the town. And what they found is a big behavior shift in parents in terms of it's changed the culture of food. It's changed how parents shop. It's changed a whole load of different things. In the transition movement here in the UK, many transition groups in local areas do work around food predominantly. So this is, for example, New Forest Transition, they've started a new food market. They start a CSA. They start lots of stuff around food that you can do at a community scale. sometimes I've seen such beautiful examples of it being bigger scale. This is in a place called Ungersheim in France, which is one of the best examples of a village in transition in France. They have a local currency called the radish. They have the biggest solar farm in the region. All of the food for the local schools is grown in a market garden run by the municipality. They built this building called the conservatory to create extra jobs, making preserves from that food. They've made many jobs, decarbonizing the place. It's a beautiful example. They do a heritage wheat projects. It's a really beautiful example when you go there of seeing actually part of rural regeneration is around how the food connects with the energy, connects with the economics, how it all kind of hangs together. This is a small town. Actually, I'm going to fly past that one because I want to tell you about my town, because I'm looking at I live in Totnes, which is a market town surrounded by its rural hinterland. And I want to tell you about two projects that I'm part of here that are about rebuilding this, again, this connection between the town and the land around it. One of them is a brewery that I'm one of the people who started, called the New Lion Brewery. We see that brewery as being a real driver for that. Last year, we became the UK's first 100% community-owned brewery. We now have 270 owners. We raised £180,000 in order to move the brewery into a space together with a mill and a bakery, using wheat grown in the fields around the brewery. We're always looking for interesting local ingredients, and these are some of our 270 owners. And this idea of businesses as a catalyst for this reconnecting is really important to me. And the second one is something called Atmos Totnes, which is one of the most ambitious community-led development projects in the country. An old 8-acre derelict milk factory that used to bring in milk from 1,300 farms in our rural hinterland. When it closed in 2007 and 170 people lost their jobs, we started a process for the community to own the site, to design it and to redevelop it. And we ran a consultation in which, in a town of 9,000 people, more than 4,500 people contributed their ideas. It was one of the most extraordinary things I've ever been part of. The community master planned that site with 62 homes that are genuinely affordable for local need, 37 homes for retired people, a new music venue, a hotel run as a community enterprise, and so on, all powered with renewable energy. The most important thing is that it is completely in community ownership. So it's a different model of how we do development. And for us, this is another driver of rebuilding those connections. How do you build a development like this where you source as many materials, building materials, from within your bioregion as possible? We can use clay plasters. We can start to then, we have a market, enough of a market in here to start putting in place the hemp production, the lime production, the stuff that we need in order to make this scheme viable. So my fundamental thing is that if we're going to create the demand and we're going to train people to do the skills that we need, we also have to create the projects that create the demand for that produce, and on a kind of an ambitious scale. I think that's my time. So just to finish, to say we got, be quiet, it's finished now, just go away. That we got planning for this scheme through a referendum. We're one of the first things to go through what's called a community right to build order. We ran a referendum. 85% of people in the town voted for this project. And I've run out of time, so this is if you want to find out anything else about me and what I do. And I really look forward to the conversation afterwards.
You're on mute.
Thank you, Flora.
That's not a good start, is it? Hello. Thank you for really, really inspiring presentations. And before I start on some of the questions that are coming in, please, folks, keep putting those questions on the chat, on the Q&A. I mean, just so inspiring, that last presentation by you, Rob, around what can be done with communities. We've had a lot on what can be done with local supply chains, and using local materials and local services. But it feels like we're up against a government machinery that is subsidizing agribusinesses, that is subsidizing the use of, I don't know, out-of-town shopping. It's subsidizing everything that isn't what we've been talking about here. do you sense a sea change, or is there any sign of do you think, a change in government policy towards supporting the local and the community-led? Rob, I don't know, would you like to start on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I would be very straightforward and say I think we are governed by maniacs, and
okay,
people who operate as if the climate and ecological emergency really wasn't a thing, and who pick it up and put it down as feels kind of appropriate to them whenever they want to. I think the smart thing to do is that there are things like the community right to build order powers that were given in the Localism Act that were really created as just a kind of a way that we might be able to unlock some brownfield sites, but actually have the potential to do something really quite profoundly radical. And so there are things like that come up sometimes, and there are other people here, I'm sure, who are much more up to speed with recent things. But some of these words around localism and placemaking and community and stuff like that, there are these things that are put out there, and what we have to do is look out for them and seize them and actually present projects that go way beyond what was had in mind by the people who write that kind of legislation, because this is really not the time for little incremental steps is way behind us. As Naomi Klein said so powerfully, there are no non-radical solutions left. It's only really the big bold things that have any place, and we need to find what works and tweak it.
That's really interesting. So I'm part of a project with Stantec, which is about mapping everything, really, systemic maps. And we've got digital planning coming up in Scotland, a systemic digital planning services planned with high-level system plans and hyper-local plans, all kind of matching together. But England is extremely behind in terms of its sort of geospatial, just knowing what's there in the countryside. Nobody seems to know, and to therefore make intelligent decisions about should something be on a greenfield site or a brownfield site. And one of the things I think is coming through in a lot of literature is actually there's far more biodiversity in many of our cities and in our brownfield sites than there are actually on the blasted acreage of agribusiness greenfield landscapes. And I just, Robbie, I want to ask you, do you think that there's a case for shaking it up around the green, sorry, I'm having a senior moment here about the green belt. Do you think there's a case for shaking up the green belt and bringing more of the city into the countryside and vice versa?
I think there's certainly a need to reevaluate what the purpose of the green belt is, whether or not bringing the city into the countryside or otherwise. It serves a very important purpose of keeping the two apart, and it's had some unfortunate consequences of forcing development to jump over it. But I think a lot of the challenges of it will be reflected in the changes in car use, and I think actually one of the things that'd be interesting is seeing how that then has an impact on the way we perceive development outside of the city and in the city, and how those links can then be forged or actually are challenged. I mean, I think one of the schemes that we've been involved with an entirely new town, it's been interesting how technology has been used to try and further reduce that dependence on cars and reduce the gap between that has been created, this sort of artificial gap that's been created between where a new centre can be created and something else is the urban hub. But should it be shaken up? I mean, I think the simple answer is yes, but without that spatial analysis that you've done, then I think it becomes a rather difficult task to really give a more accurate point on.
Now, that's really interesting. I think that there's so much research, so much data that needs to be gathered in this zone. So just before we get on to the questions coming through, I just want to ask, well, a question really for Ben. How do you ensure participation from a diverse range of demography in the events that you that you are putting on. Sometimes it feels like some of the and in the photographs and the things that you see happening attract particular kinds of demography. But are you really managing to hit people at every level in society and bring them on board?
It's a very good point, and often a lot of this conversation is often a very gentrified one, and it can attract us. I mean, Robbie talked about kind of halcyon visions of the countryside, and it often can come from that place. But the challenge, really, if you want to address the social deprivation and the key indicators which we're targeting, then the challenge is to get beyond that. And Black Mountains College emerged from a series of public meetings in the town hall where we literally first started talking about regeneration of the town, and then through facilitated conversations ended up talking about the various brownfield sites in the town, what opportunities those presented, what sort of institutions might suit those brownfield sites, and what kind of skills and jobs were necessary. And the heart of it really was a feeling that Talgarth doesn't need more houses, it needs jobs. So we then thought, well, how do we go about that? And you know, what are the historic reasons for the lack of jobs and the skills and so on? So it starts to become, once you start developing stories and you start involving people in those conversations, now we're running a community engagement process on a 120-acre farm, which is just on the outskirts of the town, which is going to be both a source of community resilience and community growing, but also woodlands, and meadows and sort of semi-commercial agriculture, as well as a campus for our undergraduate program. And over time, we expect that the activity and the study that those students will be doing, the research of those undergraduate students, will be tied into social outcomes, so that actually their own third-year projects, their own work placements will be in the service of embedding the Future Generations Act in Wales, which is a key piece of legislation. That's another point to get to Rob's conversation, the question you asked Rob about the statutory landscape, so that we begin to then build a community. And the answer is it's an ongoing struggle. We're not there yet, and that we've still got a job to do in convincing some people. But a very important part of it is community courses, but also further education alongside higher education, trying to break down that hierarchy between vocational skills and so-called academic ones, because neither will save us where we're going, and we need both. So you've put your finger on a key problem, but it goes to the heart of what we're trying to do.
Thank you. I mean, isn't part of it transportation, ultimately, for young people particularly, getting around countryside so incredibly difficult? And I'd just like to ask Petra about this, because the idea of velocity is so powerful. But I've done work on talking to local authorities about, they're so cash strapped and they can't make anything happen. Who's going to pay to bring, to bring to life these paths, and who's going to do it? How can we make it happen?
So I hope there's people from local councils on this talk tonight, and that they are aware about the £2 billion funding called Gear Change that was launched last summer by the government, and that's supposed to sort of fuel the cycling and walking revolution across the UK, and some of it has been hopefully already taken up. So I mean, just coming back to your question about how things can be shaken up, I was thinking that really there's 3 ingredients, because at every sort of like district council forum that we're invited to come and speak and inspire about velocity ideas, it boils down to transport. So transport is a massive issue. I mean, some some districts don't have good railway connectivity, and so if we're talking about cycling and walking, we actually must also have the links to the railways or to other public transport networks. So the countryside, rural areas are really have really low sort of public transport networks. So that's an important one, and I think with the gear change funding, that there's an opportunity to actually start to unlock some of the brighter ways and pathways for cycling and walking. But then it also needs investment into railways. And we've been also working with Bridport Renewal Area, working on a strategy to reuse an old railway and to connect the local villages and communities. So it's in early stages. And I was thinking also about Robbie's point about stewardship, because one thing that really is a barrier to doing development differently in the countryside is land ownership. And that's why it has taken quite a long time for Velocity to actually start to pilot our strategy with Blenheim Estate, because they are the single landowner. And so this idea of stewardship and then wanting to be the first carbon negative landed estate is about setting an example. And, you know, as soon as there's somebody who does it first, then others will follow. I think we're still at this point of early adopters, and both Ben and Rob, I think, have been amazing in actually raising aspirations for people locally. You know, you can become an owner of this brewery, or you can own a piece of your infrastructure of your community. You can have these skills, you can do something amazing locally, and so low aspirations, I think, is another big barrier which sort of prevents shaking things up. And I've been shocked at the recent sort of forum that we had with the district council, that there were all these people with opinions, you know, very knowledgeable, and then there was this young girl, maybe 13 or 14, and she was sort of the representative of the young people, and I was waiting for her to finally get to speak, and she felt like, you know, this was too idealistic and this wasn't going to happen, and it was too expensive, although actually it's cheaper and it's incremental, it can happen over time. So I think just the shocking thing of seeing, you know, some young people not believing that things can change, I think that's I mean, I hope that Ben and Rob are actually doing amazing work to change that and to involve more people in believing that there can be a change. And I think last year has showed that, and also with the gear change funding, for instance, that might not have been actually allocated if it wasn't for the pandemic.
Oh, thank you, Petra. That relates to we got a question from an anonymous person, but asking Rob actually whether a considerable amount of work needs to be done with communities to prepare the ground for the kinds of projects that you're talking about, or whether you could just get going on them.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think what Petra's talking about how, you know, I've done a whole bit of work around imagination, and this idea of why it is that when we are faced with a climate and ecological emergency, we're still so often unable to imagine anything other than what's in front of us. We're surrounded by institutions that are unable to imagine anything other. You know, is our Ministry of Defence sitting around and actively imagining a peaceful future? Is our Ministry of Transport actively imagining a world without any cars? No, they're not, because there's no space in those organizations for that kind of imagining. And I think it's one of the things that the transition movement does really intentionally and powerfully, is to make that space, is to create what if spaces where people come together in a space that's really well facilitated. And these are all completely learnable skills, you know, where people come together in the kind of events that Ben was talking about, that Black Mountains College emerged out of, is those kind of well facilitated spaces. Gil Scott-Heron very famously said the revolution will not be televised. I think if he was doing that now, he might say the revolution would be well facilitated. And we absolutely need to be bringing in some training people to be great facilitators. So a project like the Atmos project that I talked about in Totnes you know, it built off the back of work that the transition movement had been doing for a few years before that, in terms of putting on big what if spaces, big community imagining, using open space, using World Cafe, using these tools just to start to flex that sense of possibility. And at the same time, that, you know, if all we do is sit around and dream and imagine and don't do anything, then it's kind of pretty useless, really. So it was always the thing in the transition movement from the beginning was, do something practical, you know, like, so projects started. So here in Totnes, we had this sort of imagining process, we had a sort of community education process around climate change with talks and events, but we also had visible things that started happening, new gardens appearing, new solar panels appearing, new projects emerging that people could see and get involved in. And I think all of that meant that that there was a stronger sense, certainly not among everybody, but among a lot of people, that when that site came up, maybe we could actually, you know, and the more projects people see around them, the more it kind of builds belief, I think. Ben,
you want to chip in?
I'd like to echo that, yes, because I think that the more is exactly that point that Rob's punchline, that the more momentum there is, the more examples there are. So Velo City, for example, Velocity has already put a marker out there, and we can point to that. So in our planning application, we can say, look at this. And to get back to the statutory angle, like the challenge of systemic change, the challenge of political change is about knitting all of those elements together into a culture shift. And the legislation is largely there, but you've got to make the case, you've got to make the argument, you've got to hold the hand of the planners. So, you know, even us just putting in a pre-planning application for turning a farm into a university campus was a test for them, but actually expressed in their language, with all of the ticking all of the ecological boxes of the national park, all of their sustainable placemaking initiatives and everything, which the Welsh government is leaning heavily on them, and they're never hitting because they're always missing them because they're pleasing the developers. For them, actually, was a joy. This is what we should be doing, and it shows them that it's possible. And likewise, you know, they're always beaten down on their affordability allocations. They're never meeting their social housing targets and all the rest of it. But actually, you know, just by in our case, it was literally a pre-planning application, and now there's going to be some more, and there's going to be a full planning application, and we're starting to push the envelope. We're now being invited to the policy forum of the planning authority to talk about what we're doing. So it's those little steps which, you know, I'm a writer, I shouldn't be running a university, and hopefully I won't be for much longer. We'll be getting you know, an academic in charge, but it was through asking those questions and getting involved and then taking those steps that we're now pushing the envelope in the national park, which hopefully might then open eyes of other national parks. So every step matters, I think, is an important point, just on a human level, regardless of the sphere of intervention.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so Wales is coming through with some really amazing place-based policy, which we have yet to see what the outcomes of that will actually be. It's interesting. So quite a few questions and things in the side comments about being kind of about grim issues about the countryside, lack of affordable housing, lack of connection, lack of this. So it's really lovely to hear these very positive narratives of what actually is possible if people, you know, with energy, enthusiasm, join in the dots and care. So I'm just going to finish up by just doing a little last round of all our speakers, just to ask, really, you know, one thing coming out of the pandemic, what one thing would you like to see happen? What one first thing do you think is the most important? And Petra, sorry, since you're first, over to you.
Well, Flora, I think I sort of like used my card already, because I think really for me is that change is possible, and not losing the momentum that we've got now, to really believe that we can do it and that we don't have to choose, we don't have to be stuck with the old ways of doing things, and there's momentum to that. So I think in every area, not just in terms of architecture and built environment.
I think that's a really good point. What about you, Robbie? What would you like to add?
I think I would like to see the reinforcement of community. I think contact with people has been so strained over the last year, and I think the value of that is what is huge. But as people look at the way that they find themselves in new communities, whether it's as a result of COVID or otherwise, I think that finding ways to strengthen, build on community interaction and mutual support, I think is actually something which is going to be hugely valuable to the way we live, work, design, and probably lots of bits in between.
Absolutely, it's certainly highlighted the importance of that. Over to you, Rob. What about you? What are your thoughts?
I hope that it will mean that we are able to reimagine our relationship with travel. You know, I gave up flying in 2006, and we've started a movement in 50 countries, mostly done through Zoom or Skype or whatever it was then. You know, I only go to places I can get to on the train, and it's great. And I think the idea that, you know, you can only be an academic if you're prepared to go and deliver your paper at the Tel Aviv conference and the Los Angeles conference, and you can only run a business if everyone can be flown to Paris for the monthly breakfast meeting is just nonsense. And we've all been able to run really good courses and businesses and all sorts of stuff and movements and campaigns without everybody flying around all over the place. And I think it's going to mean a big reimagining of business centers in cities and how we do things, and I really hope that we embrace that rather than trying to imagine there's some mythical normal we need to get back to, because normal really didn't work for about 90% of people anyway.
Here to that. Last of all, Ben, what about you?
I think a key lesson of the pandemic, and one of the foundations of everything that we teach at Black Mountains College, is that we are one species among many. And whether we're building homes or teaching children or other people, I think that insight is central. And unless we act as though we are one of many, we're finished.
Okay, on that note, thank you, Ben. A very good note to finish up here. I would really like to thank all our speakers today for their really excellent contributions, and to all of you for showing up this evening to come and attend the Spring Forum. And thank you very much also to Rowena and Sarah for organising the thing. And I shall clock off and say goodbye to everyone. And thank you once again. Bye-bye.